What if your only shield against death was a crust of bread buried in filth, guarded not from rats, but from the starving hands of the man beside you? What if water meant disease, warmth meant punishment, and even your shadow could betray you? In Soviet prison camps, after the collapse of the Eastern Front, captured German soldiers disappeared into a world colder than war itself. No weapons, no rescue, just the raw instinct to stay breathing when everything around them begged them to stop. Survival was no longer heroic. It was negotiation with the cold, with hunger, with time. They built spoons from scrap metal, used lice to fake fevers, caught rats with bare hands and split the meat 5 ways. They dug holes under latrines to hide food, wrote messages on cloth scraps with blood, prayed in silence not for freedom, but for one more day. These weren't strategies. They were terms, set by frost, starvation, and despair. 8 brutal lessons forged in the darkest barracks of World War II. Each one a quiet, unbreakable vow to live, no matter what had to be lost in the process. If survival still means something to you, if this kind of knowledge still deserves breath, then subscribe. Carry it forward before time buries it for good. Hit like and subscribe to rediscover the skills our ancestors never wanted us to forget. One click keeps this knowledge alive. When the world forgets, we remember. Number 1. Boiled leather and tree bark. In the early weeks of captivity, the silence was deceptive. Captured German soldiers, exhausted from months of retreat, frostbite, and hunger, entered Soviet prison camps expecting suffering. What they didn't expect was absence. No food, no fire, no explanation. Rations were promised, but rarely delivered. Days passed with nothing but cold air and colder stares. Men began chewing leaves, then grass, then bark stripped from trees like animals gnawing at bone. Hunger blurred lines between living and decaying. It was then someone remembered the boots, not for walking, but for boiling. Stripped of laces and nails, leather was sliced into ribbons, soaked in snowmelt, and simmered in tin cans over barely burning twigs. The stench was unbearable, but inside those blackened strips were trace remnants of fat and protein, just enough to quiet the scream of an empty gut. Belts followed, pouches, even slivers of torn harnesses. Anything that once held tension or carried weight now carried the hope of one more breath. But leather wasn't food. It swelled the stomach but offered no strength. So men added moss, crushed bark, and bitter roots scavenged from under ice. They boiled them together, creating a sludge so foul it gagged the throat but filled the space where hunger lived. One soldier wrote, long after the war, that eating bark felt like swallowing the forest's last secret. Silent, cold, and patient. Every spoonful came with a cost. Digestive systems shut down, ulcers formed, teeth cracked. But hunger didn't care about the consequences. It only demanded silence while it fed on pride. This was not an adaptation. It was a transformation, a reversal of every instinct. Soldiers trained for battle now trained their minds to see nutrition in rot and life in refuse. In one barrack near Bryansk, they boiled the same belt 7 times. By the end, it had no texture left, only shape. But the ritual kept them breathing, not nourished, just breathing. It wasn't resilience, it was surrender, without giving up. The fire they used was barely visible, hidden behind crates, fed with smuggled straw. But in that weak flame, they saw something flicker. Not hope, just defiance. And that was enough to face the next hunger. One forgotten skill, one more day alive. Number 2, sickness by design. In the camps, sleep wasn't rest. The punishment was delayed. Labor teams left at dawn, carrying timber, bricks, or corpses. Return meant broken limbs, torn skin, and frozen blood caked behind ears. To avoid being chosen meant survival. But the only escape was sickness, and so men made themselves sick. It began with lice. Prisoners allowed infestations to grow unchecked, even encouraging them by wearing the same unwashed clothing for weeks. Lice brought a fever. Fever brought heat. and sometimes a forged diagnosis. Some went further. Ash was rubbed onto the skin to mimic disease. It dulled the tone of the body, gave cheeks a sunken cast, and made eyes appear hollow under dim light. Under Soviet eyes, weakness wasn't questioned, it was removed. Others drew blood from scabs, mixing it with water and spreading it across their chest to fake tuberculosis. It was grotesque theater, rehearsed in shadows, performed in silence. No one laughed. These men didn't fear labor, they feared collapse. Forced marches in sub-zero temperatures meant frostbite without warning. One misstep in the snow, and a limb turned black. A second misstep, and it was gone. Those who feigned illness weren't cowards, they were calculated. Even hunger became a tool. Men starved themselves deliberately, thinning their faces, making bones protrude from skin like wooden stakes beneath flesh. The goal wasn't death, it was invisibility. Camp medics, overwhelmed and under-equipped, often glanced rather than examined. A sunken chest and a trembling voice were enough to be sent to the sick barracks sometimes for days, sometimes longer. It was never safe, but it wasn't outside, and that was the difference. One former prisoner recalled smearing ash into his gums until they turned gray. He spent 5 days in a medical hut before being discovered, but those 5 days were 5 chances to not freeze to death. This wasn't deception for gain, it was a deception for breath. No reward, no strength, just one less blow from a rifle butt, one less kilometer walked with frost eating your feet. There was no manual for this, only instinct and desperation. And those who mastered it lived longer. It's a method modern prepping still hasn't reclaimed. Number 3. Catching shadows. The hunger didn't knock. It broke in. By the 3rd week of captivity, food rations, if delivered at all, were reduced to scraps. Frozen crusts, graying potatoes, or a spoon of watery cabbage broth. Each calorie became a battlefield. And in that war, rats became more than vermin. They became prey. At night, the camp stirred with faint scratching. Beneath bunks between floorboards, behind the latrine wall, rats thrived where men perished. They ate what others dropped. They moved in warmth. And they had meat. Some prisoners couldn't bear it, but others didn't flinch. Hunger had already stripped away revulsion. All that remained was calculation. They began with traps, breadcrumbs tied to thread, tin lids balanced with sticks, broken forks bent into crude snares. At first, it was trial and error, but instinct evolved. They watched movement patterns. They learned where warmth pooled after sunset, and they waited. Then came the hands. Those desperate enough learned to strike without thought. A flash of motion, a cornered body, a clenched fist in the dark. One clean hit, and the rat stopped moving. There was no celebration, just silence and fire. The meat was burned over hidden embers. Flesh curled and twitching as it cooked. Hair and bones crackled. The smell spread quickly, metallic and sour. But no one complained. Even those who refused to eat watched with envy. One rat fed 5 men. Organs, bones, even skin, everything was consumed. They called it night meat, not to honor it, but to hide it. Because punishment came swiftly if caught, guards considered rat hunting unsanitary. More than that, it revealed the truth they didn't want seen, that starvation had turned soldiers into scavengers. Anyone caught with evidence risked beatings or solitary confinement. So the cooking was done in silence, beneath crates or behind waste piles, with the smoke hidden inside layers of cloth. In one camp near Oriol, prisoners even began trading dead rats for boots or tobacco. The value wasn't in flavor, it was in staying awake, staying upright, and surviving another sunrise. This wasn't desperation. It was evolution in real time when instinct overruled pride and protein warfare. They didn't speak about it. They just chewed. One forgotten skill. One more day alive. Number 4. Buried beneath filth. In captivity, nothing stayed hidden except what no one dared to touch. Food was more than scarce. It was hunted. Stolen bread vanished in minutes. Shared rations dissolved in fists. Even the sick learned to eat in silence, eyes never leaving their last bite. So prisoners searched for one place where desperation wouldn't follow. They chose the latrines. Wooden platforms stretched over trenches filled with human waste. The stench turned stomachs. The cold turned liquid into stone. But beneath those boards, in that foul, frozen pit, men carved hiding places, pockets in the earth where they buried food in silence. Wrapped in cloth or bark, rations were lowered through cracks and wedged deep into filth. A piece of bread, a half-frozen potato, even shards of boiled leather. Anything that could vanish overnight was entombed where no one would reach, not even rats. It wasn't just about safety, it was about timing. Some buried food during night roll calls, others waited for storms when visibility vanished and guards retreated to warmth. The act required speed, silence, and the ability to breathe through sickness. But it worked. Bread hidden in a latrine would still be there the next day. Not clean, not untouched, but still there. In one camp near Smolensk, prisoners created a system. One latrine board lifted slightly at the corner. Beneath it, a shared cache. They used sticks marked with initials to separate who owned what. Honor among the starving, enforced not by morality, but by necessity. The system failed sometimes. Someone always grew more desperate. But often, the hiding place saved lives. Not because of what was buried, but because of what it protected. Hope. The knowledge that tomorrow might still offer something, even if that something smelled like sewage and froze your fingers when you reached for it. Modern survival talks of bunkers, locks, and vaults. These men used waste and rot to guard calories, not because they wanted to, because they had no other shield left. No training manual taught this. No general endorsed it. But deep beneath the boards, where no pride could survive, food endured, tech fails. But this method never did. Number 5. Melted snow in a boot thirst arrived before hunger ever left. In Soviet camps, snow covered everything. White, endless, and silent. But drinking it directly was self-harm. It dropped body temperature, froze lungs, invited sickness that no medicine could stop. Still, the need didn't care. Prisoners began melting snow inside their boots. They removed the soles, stuffed snow between layers of cloth, and held them close to the body, letting weak body heat turn ice to water. It was slow, but it kept them from freezing their own mouths. Others used metal cups left on heated bricks or smuggled fire pits. The trick wasn't melting. It was not contaminating. The same snow might have touched blood, waste, or rot. So they strained it through cloth, sometimes even socks. Dirty, but safer than nothing. One method spread quickly. Prisoners wrapped snow in rags and placed it under armpits while they slept. It melted by morning, just enough to wet the throat, enough to make it through roll call without collapsing. But the danger never left. Contaminated water triggered dysentery, which spread faster than cold. Latrines overflowed. Fever followed, and with no medicine, men began dying over sips. So they adapted again. Some licked condensation from metal pipes. Others sucked on buttons chilled from breath, pretending it was moisture. A few learned to dig below the surface, finding cleaner snow packed by wind, untouched by footsteps or filth. No one trusted the barrels left by guards. They were rarely cleaned, full of insects, lined with rust. Even desperation had its limits. Yet they drank. Always. Because no choice was ever good, just less deadly. It wasn't hydrated, it was survival in teaspoons. They didn't measure purity, they measured risk. Each sip was a calculation. Each swallow a silent wager. And still, somehow many lived. Not because the water was clean, but because the will to keep searching for it never froze. This wasn't just survival, it was memory, passed down in silence. Number 6. Hidden heat. Frost didn't knock in these camps. It crept in silently and stayed until bones forgot they were alive. Winter swallowed everything. The air shattered lungs. Steel turned to ice in seconds. And fingers, they simply stopped obeying. A match dropped was a match lost. And in those moments, heat wasn't luxury. It was life, borrowed one ember at a time. Open flames were forbidden. Fires invited questions. Punishment followed warmth. So the prisoners turned to ash. They began by burying embers in the earth-shallow pits filled with burnt wood, covered tightly with dirt and straw. The heat escaped slowly, seeping upward through layers of cloth and frozen air. Hands hovered over it. Feet rested near it. Sometimes bodies huddled around it like moths, drawn to fading light. There was no glow, no smoke, only warmth you couldn't see. In some barracks, they built ash piles inside crates. Cinders were smuggled from labor sites, kept alive in tin containers lined with wool. At night, one man watched while others slept. If the glow pulsed too strong, it was dimmed. If it died, someone risked everything to revive it. One soldier recalled hiding embers inside a hollowed-out book, pages soaked in fat, set to smolder when the cold became unbearable. It burned without light, but the smell gave it away. He was beaten when it was found, but for 3 nights, his bunkmates felt warmth in their chests again. Heat became secret currency. It was traded, guarded, whispered about, and when someone found a way to keep it burning just a little longer, they didn't speak. They just shared space. 6 men circled around a box of ash, eyes closed, hands tucked beneath armpits, breath rising in slow clouds. It wasn't enough to be warm. It was enough not to freeze. That thin line held back frostbite. It saved fingers needed to grip a spoon or toes needed to walk to the next meal line. It preserved the body. It slowed the collapse. There was no firewood, no stove, no safety, just ash, flickering in the dark, surrounded by silence. This wasn't convenience. This was necessity wrapped in dust and silence. Number 7. Bread as power. In camps where men had nothing, one thing ruled them all. Bread. Not as food, but as power. A single slice, dry and brittle, held more weight than rank, strength, or history. It wasn't consumed all at once. It was divided, calculated, counted by thread lines or thumb widths. Each crumb carried purpose, and each decision to eat or save was a wager against time. Some prisoners saved theirs beneath cloth wrappings, letting the crust harden like stone to prevent theft. Others traded instantly. A quarter slice might buy boots without soles. A half could secure a borrowed blanket. A full piece? That was protection, or medicine, or a quiet deal for warmth by the fire pit. Bartering became language. No words, just gestures. A piece of bread held out. A look exchanged. A silent nod. Nothing more was needed. But not everyone bartered. Some hoarded. They rationed their rations, cut bread with strings to ensure fairness, dried it under the mattress to make it last longer. In one camp outside Kharkov, a man was known to carry a crust in his mouth during labor, not chewing, just holding it. It reminded him why he kept walking. Then came the markers. Prisoners began marking the edges of their rations, tiny notches, counted carefully. So if stolen or tampered with, they'd know. They trusted no one. Not because of betrayal, but because of desperation. Starvation rewrote morality. Bread became a bank, and every man was both debtor and keeper. But there was a darker edge. A full ration could also make you a target. Men were robbed, beaten. Some hid their bread under dead bodies during roll call, knowing no one would search there. Others swallowed it whole, dry and painful, to keep it from being seen. Yet still they shared, not from kindness, but from memory. A piece of bread offered wasn't charity. It was defiance, proof that even here, under frost and filth, they hadn't forgotten what it meant to be human. It wasn't just food, it was dignity. They preserved their future with every moldy root. This wasn't survival, it was memory passed down in silence. Number 8. The cold cell. Not all prisoners lived in barracks. Some disappeared beneath them. Solitary confinement wasn't used just for punishment. It became overflow. When new transports arrived or outbreaks spread, prisoners were crammed into storage pits, cellars, or underground rooms, spaces meant for supplies. not survival. They called them the cold cells. No beds, no straw, just stone floors soaked with ice, walls that wept moisture from inside, darkness so thick men forgot the shape of their own hands. But something unexpected happened there. Silence became protection. In the cold cell, no one shouted, no one begged. Breath came slow, movements were minimal, the body conserved what little warmth it could generate. Huddled in corners, men pressed against one another, not for comfort, but to reduce exposure. They learned to exhale into their sleeves to trap warmth, to rock slowly, rhythmically, to prevent freezing, to breathe less, to think less. Sometimes they shared stories, not with voices, but with knocks. One knock meant water, 2 meant cold, 3 meant still alive. It wasn't communication, it was confirmation. Above them, life moved brutally. Orders shouted, guards pacing. But down there, under the floorboards of war, men practiced a kind of stillness unknown to the living. It was beyond patience, beyond endurance. They became shadows of themselves, silent forms wrapped in torn coats, eyelids heavy with frost. And yet, many survived longer in those cells than in open labor, because the cold wasn't the worst enemy. Movement was. In the silence, the body rested. Hunger slowed. Breathing became shallow. Muscles stopped trembling. And for a few, the cold cell became a strange mercy, a space where the world forgot them long enough to stay alive. In one case outside Vitebsk, a man lasted 12 days alone in a storeroom, packed with crates and ice. He melted frost off wood beams with his breath. He tore his own socks into strips and wrapped them around his wrists to preserve circulation. When they pulled him out, he couldn't speak, but he walked. And in that walk was a lesson no manual teaches. Sometimes, survival is not resistance. It's retreat into silence, into cold, into the place no one thinks to look. One forgotten skill, one more day alive. Now you know. Survival in Soviet prison camps wasn't about weapons or brute strength. It was about instinct shaped by cold, hunger, and time. Captured German soldiers, stripped of command, stripped of identity, didn't live because they were prepared. They lived because they adapted to a world that tried to erase them. There was no guide, no system, only choices made in filth, in silence, in breathless nights that froze hope to the bone. They boiled leather until it stopped tasting like death. They caught rats with their bare hands and prayed not to flinch. They buried food in human waste and called it safety. Every tactic, every method was not just about staying alive, but remembering how to. Not one of these skills came from a textbook. They came from the edge, and now they're almost forgotten. But if you've listened this far, maybe you understand what's at stake. These weren't just tricks. They were the last threads holding life together in a world that had already unraveled. Don't let this knowledge die with them. Help bring these lessons back into our world. Subscribe and stay prepared. One subscription helps revive the knowledge they died to preserve.